It's my honor to introduce this next speaker, who is our keynote speaker. She is the person who taught me everything I know. Yes. Stacie LeBlanc, she is the executive director of the Children's Access Center in New Orleans, Louisiana. She is also the director of the Audrey Hepburn Care Center, where I also trained. She has 10 years experience as being a prosecutor and taking care of abuse cases. She has a 94% conviction rate, which is excellent. She has been an instrumental person in starting a lot of programs in New Orleans, where I trained. She started the Family Violence Unit, multiple other CACs, lots of different things. She was awarded the Champion for Children's Award. She also won a very prestigious award when she went to give a talk in Washington, D.C. through the FBI. But she just has so much experience when it comes to child abuse and prosecuting these cases, and I thought it would be a great pleasure for her to come and talk with us about the things that I had to go through, the things that a lot of us have to go through when we're taking care of these children. And so one of the things that we wanted her to really come and talk about, and I know we have issues through the Crescent House, is when victims don't act like victims. And so she's going to give us a talk on that. But it is my pleasure to introduce Miss Stacie LeBlanc.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Head. Okay, can they hear me? I might have to just use this, huh? Maybe so, because I don't, can you guys hear me? Yes? Oh, good. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am so impressed with not only your turnout and how much support you have from your hospital and your mayor and your exchange club. I cannot tell you that I have that in New Orleans, and I am a little bit envious at this moment. But I wanted to come to you today. Dr. Head was, the third fellow that graduated from our program and is sorely missed in our program. You have a huge gem here, and we still say, I have team members and detectives, and I'm like, where's Dr. Head? We need her on this. She is a rock star on the stand. We could not be successful, and it's not my own personal success in prosecution, but our team's success in our program never reached to the level that we were able to hold offenders accountable for what they did to children if it wouldn't have been with that expert medical pediatric experience on the stand explaining how these kids can be normal, because it's got to dispel every myth that we ever grew up with about kindness and such. And so we really, it is such an essential component, and it's a big piece of what we do in training medical. But I want to start by telling you guys the story, because most of what I'm going to tell you here today, I did not learn ever in law school. I always say I must have missed the day in law school where they told me that children are bonded to their offenders. Because I could tell you so often, a lot of what I'll tell you this morning has more to do of lessons learned because I did it the wrong way. And so I always try to spread, please don't repeat my mistake. I can't tell you how many kids walk into my office and I said things to them like, don't you worry, I have enough evidence here to put your daddy in jail for the rest of his life. Do you think kids want to hear that? No. What do they really just want? They just wanted to stop. They just wanted to stop crawling in bed with them at night. And that sort of goes against what all of us as teens want, right? Because what do we want? We want to put him in jail, right? I always told the jurors, send him back to the rock that he crawled out from under. And don't even take a potty break. Just go back there and vote and send him right back there, okay? And truly, that was our whole agenda. And we got lots and lots of convictions. But regardless of how well I did and how many offenders we held accountable, the kids, at the end of the day, what they really wanted was just to be safe. And so a lot of times we're working against the children that we're serving. Does that make sense to you guys? And so I'm just going to tell you some of the lessons that I've learned along the way to make that a little bit easier. And I'm going to start with a case that I was involved in. I am absolutely no hero in this case. But I learned more on the back of this survivor of child sexual abuse than I ever did. I never learned it in law school, but that I ever did in any conference. This was a case that involved a 30-year-old victim who came forward when her stepsister or her sister actually had been committed to a hospital. And so she came forward not because of what happened to her. She came forward and she stepped up for someone else. You guys heard that story before? How many of our victims come out, even if, to protect someone else, not themselves? And, when she came forward, I remember I was on maternity leave. And I remember I was at Home Depot one day, and I'm strolling my baby, and I get a call from Detective Nolan. He says, Stacie, we got one of those cases. It's a crazy case. This woman has repressed memory. And I'm like, I'm a prosecutor. I know repressed memory is real. I've read about dissociation. I'm not a mental health expert. But I know enough to know, okay, but that's probably not going to be enough to prosecute. She says she had a baby by her stepfather. And she would have conceived that baby when it was an aggravated rape. It would still be pending 30 years later in the state of Louisiana. And we have until 30 years to the victim's 48th birthday. So in this particular case, it was still pending. And I'm like, well, Darren, get the DNA. Detective, get the DNA evidence. Let's see. And in this particular case, it came back that it was 99.9% that it was his baby. But we had to also get DNA on mom in this case. Because in this particular case, and it shocks our conscience, her mom was a nursing supervisor. And her mom told her fellow folks on her unit that her child had been raped and that she wanted to protect her child. And they put the mom's name on the birth certificate as the mother. And so all these years later, now mom knew it was him. Mom knew. She literally told me in my office one day that she remembers the day that he had first penetrated her and it hurt. He had done a lot of different things for penetrating her, but on this particular time it hurt, and she actually had some bleeding, which we know only happens in less than half of our victims. But in this case, she actually did bleed. And she remembers calling Mom, and she said, Mom, he did it again. But this time he put it so far in me it hurt, and I was bleeding. And the blood got on the new bedspread. What do you think Mom might have said to her? Oh, darling, I'm coming. We're calling the police. We're going to protect you. We're going to do everything we can. Yes, that's exactly what she said. She told her, and I'll never forget to this day, this woman is sitting in my office. She's 30 years old. I can talk to her like another adult. And she said, her mom said, soak the bedspread in cold water so the blood doesn't set. And that's what we're talking about. That is what's important.
We're having some technical. But in this particular case, this mom was not there for her. And so this child had for years gone through this with no one at her back, no one to protect her. And in this particular case, we had to get DNA evidence to prove that grandma is grandma and not mom of the child. That makes sense? And so we were no hero. We were able to get 40 years. He pled. But when I can tell you, on the day that he pled, I had myself and my victim assistance coordinator and the forensic interviewers and the folks at the Children's Advocacy Center on what we call the bride sides for prosecutors, okay? And we were all sitting there to support the victim. And on what we call the defendant side, the perp side, was his entire family. And they all had Doronax bags, that's our local grocery store in New Orleans, filled with cigarettes to give him as he was going into jail. And the survivor, her daughter, who was a product of this incest, literally spit on my survivor as she walked up into the court. And we do believe that most likely that child was also probably a survivor, but she was not disclosing. And I learned so much on the back of this adult victim. But I'll never forget, and the one story I want to share with you about this case, and I'm not going to share a whole bunch of war stories with you, but I'll never forget, on a particular day, I went over and I talked to my elected district attorney, and I said, I think I have enough to go after Mom, too. I think you guys think she was accountable for what happened? Right, absolutely. So I went across the hall, I talked to my research department, and I said, I think I have enough. Could I charge her as an accessory after the fact, or even a like as a principal to this offense? And they were willing to go with me. So I brought her in my office, I sat her down, and I said, I've got really good news. My office is going to allow me to charge your mom. What do you think she said? What do kids do? They take it back. What do we call that? Recantation. And so, in reality, I learned on the back, and I'm sitting there, and I remember her saying, Ms. Schrieffer, I made it all up. It's not true. I have the DNA evidence sitting on my desk. And she literally talked to me so many times, and she recounted things in vocabulary that sounded like a 7-year-old, because she still processed this trauma as the 7 and 8 and 9 and 10-year-old survivor that she was. But I learned so much on her back. And so what I'm going to share with you today is just some of the things that I've learned in dealing with survivors, and my lessons learned, and why it is we don't expect that. Because I never expected her to not want mom to be prosecuted. And in that particular case, I had to negotiate that I was not going to prosecute mom. Now, did I like that? No, but that was the end result that I actually had in that particular case. She was not going to testify if I was going to prosecute her mom. And so I learned so much, on her back in order that I could hold that and do it for other cases. But she was 11 when she actually gave birth. And the only defense in this particular case was that they had said that she had conceived the child while they were in Europe. And so I had to get the passport to prove. That was the really only evidence I actually needed in this case to prove it occurred. But it's so often we miscommunicate what our goals are. Our goals a lot of times are conviction, protection. We have to, as the prosecutors, we have to protect all the children in our jurisdiction, in our counties. But what do you think the kid's goal is? And I think you guys already identified it, but it truly isn't not showing up there. But I really do believe it is just to be safe. Now, you guys started this morning, and Dr. Saunders, I thought, did such an amazing job of talking of prevalence. And I just want to give you an idea of what we're talking about. I left prosecution after 10 years. I started that work in 1989. And I left prosecution to basically start a medical program, because I realized that even in that particular case, if I didn't have competent, highly qualified medical providers to explain how kids can be normal and how they delay in disclosing and how they're bonded to their offenders and all these other dynamics that you guys as professionals learn, I would not be successful. And so I started the Audrey Hepburn Care Center, and we started a fellowship program, which Dr. Head completed. And we've had lots of doctors, all of whom have gone back to their hometowns, like Macon, to do this work, and we miss her desperately. But we've had so many kids. When we started, we had, 7 kids a day that would walk up our steps. Last year, we had over 1,400 kids, and since I've been there, we've served over 14,000 children we have served in the last 14 years, which is crazy. Now, one of the things I think is so important to remember about victims, where do they come from? What does the general public think our victims, where do they think they come from? What do they look like? They look poor. They come from bad homes. Do they come from our homes? Not educated homes, right? You ever go into a school to talk, and if you're in a good private school, and you'll ask, do you guys have a sex abuse problem here? And they're like, no, not here, no, over there in that school. My other thing is, oh, no, I live in a gated community. And I'm like, well, that's really good, because now you have just locked all your offenders in, But they come from, and this is the parishes that we serve. They come from all homes. They come from our homes. They come from our neighborhoods. They come from gated homes. Child sexual abuse, and I don't need to tell you guys, crosses every, and I heard it said so well this morning, every socioeconomic, cultural, religious, poor, every racial boundary that there ever was and ever will be. And I think it is so important, because there is a huge myth that it does come from poorer homes. And we have got to bust through that. Now, I'm a big believer in research. I don't just tell you just from my experience. If I don't have research to back it up, and I was so glad to hear you guys are going to have access on the website, because I will put all my slides with all the research basics, because I really think it's important to know that. Probably the most shocking thing, I stand before you, and I know by being here, you guys, especially, you guys are the top 2% of education in the country, right? All of you that have bachelor's degree and extended degrees, you're actually considered in the top 3 to 2% of the country in education. So are your children more at risk of child sexual abuse or less? More, yeah, that's what the research tells us. The more educated the non-offending caregiver is, the less likely that they are going to support and believe their children, which is the number one risk factor. Doesn't that shock your conscience? And it's like we could all go through, how can that be? How can it be? But until we all start believing that child sexual abuse can happen in our home, our gated community, we will never see or be able to protect children. Make sense? And I think it's just so important. I heard the stats. This is the CDC stats that are still sticking with the 1 in 4 by 18 and 1 in 6 by for boys, 1 in 6. I think it's really important. There is some evidence that that's going down, which is great because of programs like Darkness to Light. But I think it's really important, especially when we're standing in a medical community. Let's compare that to other diseases that affect children, okay? So when you look at that in comparison to other diseases, it is 19 times more common than intellectual disabilities, okay? 30 times more common than childhood autism, and 75 times the rate of childhood cancer. 75 times the rate. I think in my book that reaches to a prevalence or an epidemic. But yet it's because of the Exchange Club and folks that are raising the money. You know, we don't have the resources to even address this problem, and it's a big, huge issue. Now, the good news is, because of programs like Darkness to Light, which I was so excited to hear y'all had that on your agenda, I'm a big, huge believer in, we got to put the burden on the adults. But because of programs like this, it is believed that the numbers of the prevalence are gone down, that it's probably more like 1 in 10 at this point. And so, you know, I'm very delighted that because of Darkness to Light and these programs, that we are seeing reduction. And I do believe that we can prevent child sexual abuse if, one, we learned how to react appropriately, if we learn how to respond appropriately, and we learned how to report, and we put the burden on the adults. I really, truly do believe, and I put all of my prevention efforts for child sexual abuse with this program. So, but still, even at 1 in 10, we can all congratulate ourselves and say, oh, okay, that's really good. We've made some progress. 1 in 10 children. I mean, that's just crazy, children. And we also know that for a long time we said 1 in 6 boys. We now believe the reverse might be true. It is so hard for males to be survivors. It is more difficult for them to step up than it is for females. And yet their risk of suicide is that much higher. And so we're missing a whole gender of children that we need to be serving. But I think it's interesting to look historically. It wasn't that long ago that we believed as a society, as a country, that this was a very rare thing. And that is probably why we are where we are today, because if you don't believe it exists, you won't protect your children. So just look at this reference. So this is a 1975 textbook on psychiatry, okay? And literally they are estimating, look at this estimate, 1 in 1 million children. Yet we know now, based on the studies that were done for the children that lived then, that's when it was absolutely validated it was 1 in 4 and 1 in 6. We're here today because of that ignorance. Does that make sense? And that's why it's so important that each of you go out and tell those extra 10 people and those extra 7 people. Now, the biggest myth that exists in child sexual abuse that allows even our children to be abused is that the person who abuses kids, we can protect our kids if we tell them, avoid the man in the park with the puppy. How many times have you guys heard that? Anybody ever tell their children to avoid the man in the park with the puppy? Yeah, and I'm here to tell you, I told my children that too until I went through Darkness to Light and became a steward of children. I actually believe, yeah, there might have been some cases of men in parks with puppies, but the cases that we serve, the children that we serve daily, they don't involve men in parks with puppies. They involve who? People that live in their homes, stepdad, dad, you got it. They're not strangers. This is the biggest myth that allows this number and this prevalence to exist. And we have got to bust through this. So here's another study that was just on the news about, do you want to help me find my lost dog? People aren't instructing their children. I personally despise campaigns like this because it takes the focus away from the real problem. And the real problem exists in homes, and we've got to get back there. So the real problem is there's somebody luring in that house. Now, when victims don't act like victims, what happens when daddy, stepdaddy, other male in the home, possibly a female, sexually abuses kids? Do they run and tell? No. And do the offenders have to use force? No, this is like preaching to the choir. You guys have got all this, right? So over 90% are well known to the child and to the family. We always talk about grooming. Who do most perpetrators groom before they groom the kid? The family, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many cases. I prosecuted 2 cases where literally the mom came in and said, yeah, I knew he was a registered sex offender, but I knew that he didn't do it. He actually told me you were a witch with a capital B and that you prosecuted him for something he didn't do. And to show him that I believed in him, I let him be alone with my children. And now she's sitting in my office. I mean, they groom the families first. And why do they do this? Why don't they injure the kids? Because it allows them what? Continued access for a sickness that they have to fill. So offenders achieve this secrecy. The reason our victims don't tell is because offenders are so good at being offenders, and we're not addressing the correct problem. They make the child feel culpable. They tell the child it's something about them internally, something about their beauty, something special about them that made them do this. You guys heard this 100 times over? Yes. The guilt and the affection. And they use this affection and kindness and gifts to seduce the children and the caregivers. But I always like to say they have so many tools in their toolbox, they do not ever need to use force. I've been doing this work now for 24 years. I have yet to be involved in a case where the primary charge was forcible rape. Most of our children, whether they're teenagers or they're 4-year-olds or they're 7-year-olds, are consenting because of the offenders that they have and the tools that they use. Now, one tool that they do use is they actually say the children come on to them. Have you ever heard of this? Yes. So this was one of my favorite headlines. This 4-year-old came on to this 25-year-old. Crawled underneath the Afghan on the couch, and he thought that's what the 4-year-old wanted to do. The 4-year-old, in his mind, initiated the behavior. Now, he put lots of evidence out there about how this 4-year-old initiated the behavior. Guess what? Do some children who have been abused sexually become reactive? Okay, we used to call it acting out, but now we say it's reactive. This child had previously been a survivor. Could there have been some crazy truth to this? Now, this is a meeting of 2 bombs waiting to come off, right? Because you got an offender. Because just because a 4-year-old's reactive doesn't mean an adult male is going to react to that, correct? I mean, he was obviously an offender who took advantage and was prosecuted for this case. But this is what I'm talking about when we say when victims don't act like victims. In the last couple of years, I can't tell you how many MDTs I attend where the evidence being presented is the victim's Facebook page or Instagram page or snapshot count and showing how they might have initiated the contact. Does that make sense? And literally what's happened is we're starting to say, well, maybe that's what she wanted. And so we're refocusing the blame. Where is the blame here? The blame has got to stay on the offender. So when we talk about this, we got to make sure that we are accounting for that 20% of these cases, and nationally, 20% of cases, I can tell you of the cases in New Orleans, they walked up to the Audrey Hepburn Care Center last year, it was 26%. They were there not only because someone sexually abused them, but that someone was another juvenile. You guys seen an increase in those cases? And so we've got to be aware they are still survivors, correct? But in a lot of these cases, we might have reactive children who are also being a part of our situation. So we have a lot of programs for teens in New Orleans. We have a teen sex and the law program that teaches, and Dr. Finkelhor has told us that we have a lot of work to be done of teaching kids about the laws so they won't be caught in that. And we do a lot of what-ifs with this and going on with this. I love this campaign. Have you guys heard about this campaign in Canada? Don't Be That Guy. It's focused the entire effort, especially when it comes to teenage sexual behavior when it involves alcohol. It is focused taken the focus totally off the don't dress that way. We all kind of got past that. But don't go there, have a buddy, have a designated thinker. It's taken the focus completely off of that and placed it on the male bystanders. And they have actually already shown in many, many areas in Canada that they've had a 10% reduction in reported rapes. So there's a lot of work to be done that has shown some really good efficacy. I personally love this quote by Finkelhor. We cannot be effective if we assume that all such relationships of sexual activity involving adults and young people start with a predatory type of adult behavior. We have got to realize that, yes, the adult should be held accountable, but our children, because they're sexualized a lot by our media, by what they observe, by the fact that Victoria's Secrets is selling very sexualized, garments to young children, that they are very sexualized, and we have got to realize that we have to protect these children the way they are. So let me ask you guys a question. Statutory rape. Are consenting teenagers really a victim? Yes. I will tell you, lesson learned. As a prosecutor, back when I was doing this, I averaged 373 cases a year. I had about a 70% or 72% cases I accepted, and I reviewed all non-arrest cases. I can tell you, in the first 6 years I was prosecuting, I never took a case of statutory rape. Never did. It wasn't until Janet Reno came on the stand and literally started saying, okay, show us your stats. And I very proudly showed our stats. Look at all the ag rapes. Look at all the people served in real time. But my statutory, in Louisiana it's called carnal knowledge, was zero. I never took those. She came in, she dropped charges. Juliet and Romeo mom and dad were dealing with it. Dad was upset. You know the cases. I never took them. And the ABA came out and said, shame on people like me. Because what they basically said is, yes, they are survivors, and that we need to understand that they have been historically underserved by the criminal justice. And they literally said that statutory rape victims share the same characteristics as victims of childhood sexual abuse and domestic violence. But that because they act like teenagers, and they can be very prickly when they act like teenagers, that we don't see them as such. We don't even treat them as victims. We actually have a kind of more angry response, a much more shaming and blaming response. And so as a result, we never get to reach them. And yet they're the highest risk for teenage pregnancy. And where is most of our maltreatment coming? What's our biggest, highest risk for child maltreatment? Teenage pregnancy. I mean, this is where the ABA and different folks are saying this is how we can address the problem. And we have got to start here, that statutory rapes really are victims and that they're ignored. And so in about, truly for me, I mean, it was the late 90s when I started saying, I've got to take all these cases. And I treated them like domestic violence. You could not drop charges. Now, we did do a diversion program. And I cannot tell you how much then I realized that there was human trafficking going on, that a lot of these kids were being given gifts by older adults. And now we have a lot more enlightenment about that. So what they've done is these studies have come out, and they have basically said that 2/3 of teenage mothers reported being molested by an older adult and the father of the baby. These same cases are becoming our child physical abuse cases. So if we want to address child maltreatment, we're actually going to have to start buying into statutory rape is really a crime. Does that make sense? And it's hard. It's hard. It was hard for me as a prosecutor because I thought I was doing a good job. And I was like, what do you mean? This is a whole bunch more cases that I'm going to have on my caseload. Oops, what happened here? I'm not liking that. I touched the middle. Come show me. I'm not happy. What did we do? I'm sorry, guys. What is y'all's experience with statutory rape been? While Dr. Head fixes me up here. Thank you, dear. Huh? You have a lot of it? And all communities are basically reporting that they have a ton of it. Here, no, that's there. I don't know why that did that. Okay, But you know what? Does it working? Yeah. Oh, yes, 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 yes. And you have a lot of it. And all communities are reporting that. And a lot of communities are reporting that that's just not the highest priority. And what basically the ABA came out and told us is that if we start addressing that as a priority, that we will actually be a part of long-term prevention. Does that make sense? Now, I know for some of you, do I have any detectives here? I have a lot of detectives in New Orleans who are like, Stacie, if we took every one of these cases where Romeo and Juliet get caught with their pants down, we won't have time to look at all your other cases that are more important. And I'm with you. That's hard work. And I can tell you as a prosecutor, when I went to my team and said, I'm getting pressure from the Office of Violence on Women, that we've got to take these cases, folks really felt like this was not really an agenda item. But what they were saying is that this sense of immortality that teenagers have, that they're not a victim, actually prevents us as adults to see them as such. And as a result, we aren't as able to serve them. The other thing that came out was a legislative handbook, because I went to the state of Louisiana and I said, we just have a 2-year age difference. Can we change that to about 5 years? But they came out and they said to legislators, don't you dare. The only way you can prevent child maltreatment is having these laws on the books. I thought we needed to increase the age. There's been a lot of pushback that they don't want this, that we have got to see this as prevention of child maltreatment. Is that a little different than you guys have thought about that in the past? I mean, for a lot of folks it is, and it's been really kind of hard to digest. What's interesting, though, is not only do we have a hard time sympathizing with teenage victims of statutory crimes, okay? Their parents do. Parents tend to support younger victims and blame older victims. You guys seen that? Tons. So not only do we as professionals not wrap our services around them and our advocacy center efforts around that, and it doesn't mean anything unique about this community or any community. It's a universal problem, and the ABA is addressing it. And so we need to get apart. Now, what is the number one predictor of how well a survivor is going to do long term? I just popped it up there. It's maternal support. It truly is. Is this a surprise to anyone here? Have you guys, anybody ever seen Detective Mike Johnson from Texas present? He does an awesome presentation. I love Mike. And he literally always says, if you only have funding for one survivor, it should be the non-offending caregiver. Because the reality is, no matter how well we do in treating the ACEs that our child survivor has, if mama doesn't believe her, her trajectory is not all that great. So if we're leaving this child in the home, we've got to make sure that these non-offending caregivers are bought on with them. And this is something we just have to get back a part of. So regardless of the outcome of the trial, now this was hard for me as a prosecutor. Have any of you guys ever been involved in a case where it's over? You ever been there for the verdict? And then it's when the prosecutors are going out for happy hour, right? We're like, we won, it's a good day, the jury comes back, less than 10 minutes, we got a conviction. And I'll turn around to older survivors and their parents, and they've been waiting for this moment. They have put off going to therapy. Have you guys ever seen that? Because all I need is for him to go to jail. And once he goes to jail, I don't need to go to therapy, I'll feel better. And it's at that moment, that clink of the jail, gate, okay, and those handcuffs and watching him, they're like, I don't feel better. Because jail doesn't fix the pain. It doesn't cure the adverse childhood experience. And so it is so important, because regardless of how well we hold the offender accountable, and this was hard for me as a prosecutor, I think I'm doing a great job. I'm putting the offender in jail. I fixed the problem. It's not really doing anything for our survivor. And so it's so important. Do they think their parents support them? Do sometimes you have supportive parents? Do you guys think sometimes you have supportive parents? Yeah, we do. But you know what? The kids tell us no. The research basically tells us that the parents fool us in most cases. Even in the best of cases, the parents sometimes aren't as supportive as we would. And that when you talk to adult survivors and they look back, they'll say, my mom did the best she could do. Okay? I don't blame her for what happened. But beneath that line is my mom really didn't support me. And I don't mean to pick on moms because sometimes we are talking about dads. But 50% of the children reported feeling afraid or ashamed from their parents' response. And indeed, their parents did, indeed, even with young children, blame them. In some regard, they blamed them. What's the number one thing that all of us in this room would do? How many of you have told your children, if anybody ever touches you, you can tell me? So what's the first thing you're going to think when your 1 in 10 children are sexually abused? Why didn't you tell me? How many times did I tell you to tell me? Does that make sense? We're all going to think it. That's the blame and shame I'm talking about. Does that make sense? We're all sort of guilty of this. I'm Catholic. I'm raised on guilt, so I always throw that in there. But reality, it's a part of what we do, and people don't even realize that they're doing it. Now, I'm going to tell you one story, and I don't share a lot of personal stories, but, I've done this work for 24 years. I've told my kids thousands of times if anybody touches you. They're like, Mom, stop with the sex lady stuff, okay? I started a program, teen sex and law in schools, and I go school to school, and my son's like, if you come to my school and you're the sex lady, that's it. I've had it, okay? So he goes to World Youth Day with his school. He was asked to go, and I called up, and I volunteered to be a chaperone, and they said, oh, no, we only have men on this trip. I said, well, my husband will be a chaperone. No. This is chaperoned just by the priest. He's going to be fine. It's all good. He's going to visit the Pope. So I'm like, okay. So I go to the Gap, and I buy my son, this is called secondary trauma, right? So I go to the Gap. I buy him some, pajama pants. I sew up the fly, okay? I'm embarrassed to say. And I tell him what he can do while he's in Spain, if in the event anything would happen, who he could tell, how we could call. I give him an emergency phone that if anything would ever happen, he's going to be with all these teenagers, going to be living in quarters. And he's like, Mom, really stop. So he sends me postcards while he's in Madrid. I get the postcard, having a great time. It was fabulous. I got lost in Barcelona. I wasn't worrying about the right stuff. And at the end, he signs it, Love, Trey, TPC. So I pick him up at the airport. I'm at, Moisan, and I go to pick up my son, and I hug him, and he whispers in my ear, and he goes, Mom, did you figure out what TPC meant? I'm like, no, what? I'm sorry, NPC, no penal contact. Okay. It's a true story. It's an embarrassing story. I tell that story because please don't traumatize your children. My kids always say, Mom, really? They now know we have secondary trauma because of the work you do. But we do. We tell our children over and over, just run and tell. So do child victims know what their parents think? A lot of times they do, even if they don't say it. Because if you found out that my kids were sexually abused, all right, are you going to want to come to a prevention program that I put together? This always kills me because people actually nod no, which kills me. I'm like, but true, you wouldn't want to hear what I had to say because you would think if I can't protect my kids and if those of us who do this work can't protect our kids, we would blame our kids, even how as entrenched we are. And so a lot of parents, the best of parents, do blame their kids, and their kids know it because they didn't tell. And that the estimates of parental support strongly differ from what we think than what the children think. And so we just need to be conscious of this. Have you guys ever felt a tug-of-war sometimes with a caregiver? Any prosecutors here? No? Okay, so I can tell you as a prosecutor, I used to say very naive things like, I kind of wish my cases came without a mom, and which is a crazy statement. The thing they need most is their mom, right? But I felt like in the best of cases, and the mom was protective, she was angry with me because I didn't put him in jail before it happened, right? Or why wasn't I taking this to trial next week instead of 2 years when it was likely going to go to trial? And once I took it to trial, she was like, what took you so long? That was my best of case. And my worst of case was a mom that didn't believe. And I think it's really important to understand because we don't understand how victims act the way they do because we have to understand how their parents respond to them. So the research basically tells us that 34% of moms, non-offending parents, Their initial response, 34% of them, is offender-oriented. And what could that sound like? What does offender-oriented sound like? There's no way he would have done that. He loves you. You go with him all the time. He wants to go somewhere, you go with him alone. He wouldn't have done that to you. What else could it sound like? I mean, it truly is. I can't believe you're ruining my relationship. I finally have a good man. Why did you go in your room? I used to tell detectives, do me a favor, every case you investigate, go inside the child's room and see if there are any locks. I prosecuted more cases where there was a deadbolt because Mama told her, you better lock your door so he can't get in there at night. Because in her mind, the child was letting them in. I had more cases where we found extra locks on the inside of kids' doors. Okay? And so 19% are self-oriented. And what does that sound like? What's going to happen to me? And what's a lot of time going to happen to Mom? And I'm sympathetic. What's going to happen? She could lose her financial support. I mean, could she maybe lose a house? I mean, maybe the kid won't be able to go to the same school. Maybe they won't live in the same neighborhood. I mean, a lot of bad could happen to Mom. And so they do go through a crisis. But what we find is only 15% are actually child-oriented. But this is bad news, too, because those who are really child-oriented, a lot of times what they say to the detectives and the Children's Advocacy Center and the therapists and the child abuse docs, they say, we don't need you. I'm protecting this kid. We're fine. Okay? You've got the problem of protecting the rest of the state. Nothing's ever going to happen to my child. That is child-oriented. You with me? But what do we want as the team? We want to protect the rest of society. So a lot of times it is a tug of war, and we need to be conscious. Now, this mom, what does this non-offending parent sound like? I didn't know. I didn't hear. She told me, but I wasn't listening. Oh, I didn't mean that blood that she was talking about on that bedspread was from sex. You know, I mean, they literally hear no, see no evil, right? This mom. Teenagers experience this mom over and over and over. But even 7-year-olds experience this non-offending parent. And this is why they don't act like the victims we're expecting to serve so often. The phony parents. You guys ever met these parents? The phony parents. What are they doing? They're at your Children's Advocacy Center. They're at Crescent House, and what are they doing? They are on the phone. They are calling everybody. You're not going to believe what he did. Oh, my goodness, so much me. You know, it's all about me. It's all about me. And a lot of times they're really not there for the kids, and it can get really, really difficult. What about this parent, this non-offending parent? This would be me, right? This would probably be all of us in this room. Have any of you ever said when you had kids, I will never let them sleep out? You know, I have my darkness to light rule. If you have one child sleep over, you have to keep the door open. If you have a slumber party, there's safety in numbers. You can shut the door. But I have to come in every hour. You have no expectation. You can't lock a door. I mean, I have done all of this. I am this parent, okay? I wouldn't want to deal with me either if anything happened to my kids. So, I mean, I think it's important. And the kids have this reflection, and this is why a lot of times they act. This mom who's protecting, you know, her cubs. I mean, a lot of times they come across really aggressive. Sometimes we might see this mom in a custody dispute, and we have a hard time believing her, this non-offending parent. So it's just really, really, truly important to understand. I've learned the hard way about moms. I had a case one time where I prosecuted, and we had 5 kids, 3 of which were in foster care, 1 of which actually came to court in a courthouse without her grandmother. I had 2 kids in this particular case that came in stiletto heels and lipstick and stuff, and I had to send a victim assistance coordinator to Walmart to get little white tennis shoes and redress her because she wasn't going to look like a victim, right? So in those cases, but in this particular case, I had one mom who was the protective mom, who always said, I knew that Raymond Tometa, I knew that band guy, he looked like a perpetrator. She went on the radio and she talked about how he looked like a perpetrator. Guess what the jury did in this particular case? They came back, found him guilty on the 4 kids that I redressed that had no parental support, found him not guilty on this child where I had a hymenal transection. The only evidence, the only physical evidence I had in this case was this 10-year-old child. But the jury didn't like the mom and how angry she was and how protective she was. And as a result, they punished her, because I talked to him afterwards. Did you not believe this little girl? I mean, she was so credible and had so much detail, and we had a high mental transaction. You didn't believe her? Oh, no, we believed her. But that mom is crazy. And so jurors will hold accountable. And so we have to know and be aware of this, because we're serving these families. Does she exist? Does this non-offending parent exist? Yeah. And she wants to give us all lip service, but we have to understand that there's more to this, and we have to help them. I think that it's really, really important as teams that we wrap our resources around our non-offending parents as much as we do our kids. Does that make sense? Kind of goes back, we've got to have that resource to send them to therapy. It's really, really hard. I think children's advocacy centers sort of act like grandparents. Any of you had your firstborn child? And I remember going to my parents' house, who adored me. I won the lottery of parents, okay? I have wonderful parents, all right? But I remember driving up to the back of the house and them running out, grabbing the car seat out and all the equipment that I would carry with. You would take luggage every time you go somewhere with your new infant. And they grab the baby and they put her in the house, and they live in the suburbs of New Orleans, and they always lock their doors. And before I got out of the car and got to the door was locked, okay? So, but truly, it's all about the kid, right? I think sometimes we do this in children's advocacy centers. I've seen this in my own center. The kid walks in, oh, let me get you the Cheetos, let me get you the juice, oh, let me get you the book, oh, come and play, oh, we have crafts here today, we have volunteers here today, and there's mom, and she is really non-offending parent. Okay, I don't want to be gender biased, but those non-offending parents, they are truly in crisis, okay? But we'll wrap around the kids. And what do the kids need at the end of the day? Because we're not going home with them with our crafts, right? They need mom. So what do we have to do? We got to wrap around mom and the non-offending parent, so when they go home in the car, that they're with them. Does that make sense? I'm kind of preaching to the choir. I always say, what can we do to support the non-offending parents? I call them nopes. Involve them in the process. Try so hard not to blame them. Note and focus on their protective behaviors, or fake it, okay? And I always said, as a prosecutor, the one thing I did in front of the jury is, when I couldn't do myself really well, I had to fake it and be someone else. And we always learn that in law school. If you're someone that's a slob, you're going to have to fake someone else. It's really hard. One of the things in our program that we have always done is, if there's a parent that comes in that we're really not feeling it, what we'll say to that parent is, I wish all of our parents were just like you. I wish all of our parents had a dad that came here today. I wish all of our kids, had a parent, that's working so hard to serve their child. I wish all of our parents, would take off work to be with your child. You have to find whatever is their strength, and you got to go with it. Does that sort of make sense? And that is the only way we can serve our victims. I mean, it truly is. Okay, why is this so important to prosecution? Why is this so important? If the children are believed by their parents and supported their parents, their likelihood of full disclosure goes up exponentially. So if we want to be successful, we're going to have to focus a lot of our efforts on these parents. So I always like to say, I changed from a tug-of-war with the parents to it's all about caring for them. And it's all about changing our perspective in order to serve them. We give them concrete things to say. And I love this that goes out to foster parents. We give it to all of our parents, and it's free on the internet. That sexually abused children must understand that they're not to blame, because they feel that blame, and that family's immediate response is so important. So I personally, and it comes from all my training with Darkness to Light, that I think how we respond to abuse is really, really important, okay? And we need to train parents and adults and everyone you talk to, and when you're on the elevator, and I always do a lot of role playing. I do a ton of mandatory reporting training. But if you are with children a lot, I don't care what area you work in, whether you're a mandatory reporter or not, if you have a child that believes in you, 1 in 10 in them might tell you their darkest secret. And what are you going to do in that moment? What are you going to do in that moment? Okay, and the research basically tells us at that moment that you're going to have like a snow globe moment. That truly you're going to have one of those, the best indicator is a child telling you this. So if you get home tonight and there's a little 7-year-old in your neighborhood that you care about, or your niece or your nephew or your own child, and they run up and they whisper into your ear, "My dad put his pee-pee in my pee-pee last night," because that's what it sounds like, right? What are you going to do in that moment? Hug them. I love that. Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. A lot of times I'll go into schools and they'll say, "Well, I'm going to report it." So you can turn to the 7-year-old and say, "Okay, I have to go report this to the police." Because you got to respond first, right? So what are you going to do? Hug them. You're going to support them, right? You're going to say something to let them know that you believe in them. But we have to be honest. The research tells us the reaction of that person has long-term psychological impact. It is so important of how we do respond to them. So when a friend reports abuse, it's not only stressful for them, it's also stressful for the person hearing it. And it truly is like that brain in the snow globe. So I like to kind of reflectively listen. So it's like you want to tell that child, "Your dad put his pee-pee in your pee-pee?" Just to make sure you heard it correctly. Does that make sense? And it's just so important that we reflectively listen and we have something. Now, the other thing that I always do with folks is I'll say, stop, drop. When someone's on fire, what do? Stop and roll. So you don't have to roll, but you got to listen and reflect and let that child know in that moment that you're with them and you believe them and that you're there for them. How are you going to tell them you believe them is probably a personal thing. This is a cheat sheet that I have developed over time and looking at the research of what victims say that they want to hear. Okay? And what rolls off my tongue is, "I'm sorry that happened to you," because I am. I know that means that child has an ace. Make sense? And so I think it's so important that we're cognizant of that. The number one thing we want everyone to know is to never ask this. We're all thinking it. Forensic interviewers have to get it for the prosecutors, but they do it in a non-leading and a non-shaming or blaming way. But it's just so, so important. And this is, our kids, you guys know this, they don't run and tell, right? Research tells us 53% of them delay at least a week to 2 years. We know many take it to their grave. Fewer than half first disclose to their parents. What does that tell us? And over 40% did not disclose spontaneously, but only did so after they were prompted. And when you look at this. This is cases where it was videotape proof that there had been child pornography and that there's a survivor that's a survivor of child sexual abuse. And in these cases, these kids did not disclose. Is that not just amazing? So, when you think about it, we should not be wondering why they don't tell. Instead, we should be celebrating that they do. And it's so important that, yes, some children do promptly tell. Most don't. You with me? Some give partial, some give progressive. Many are accidental. And some children never tell. And many are initiated by others. Why don't they delay? It's very complicated, but the research kind of breaks it down into 3 areas. There is this small group called naivete that at a very young age, they don't even realize what's happening to them is wrong. But usually by the time they're out of diaper age, they do know. So by about 7, that's why we don't do these good touch, bad touch programs, because that's shaming and blaming. One, because what happens? Do children have a physiological response to sexual touch? Often they do. And if we used to go into schools, which I did, and say, if you have a bad touch, you need to tell, what if for that child it felt good? Very confusing, shaming, and blaming. And so we know that goes away by age 7 when we were in those schools. And those external factors is what a lot of us believe is why kids don't tell. But the reality is much more to do with these internal factors of why they don't tell. And so many of our kids. But look at this. Only 1% of children of what are estimated or sexually abused actually report per year. So we have so much more work to do. Do kids cry when they tell? Do we expect them to when victims don't act like victims? We do. A lot of folks think that they're going to cry. But the research basically tells us that they're mainly relaxed and neutral. And that 98% did not cry. And many disassociate when they're telling. So Male victims actually do exhibit a little more distress, but again, most are neutral. But it's so important to understand when we're talking about survivors that demeanor, regardless of what it is, does not matter in detecting the truth, which goes against everything we believe. And that's why it's so important to educate jurors about this important stuff. So is lying a part of the disclosure process? It is. The process of disclosure basically says that kids go from active to tentative, through recantation, and that so many of them do recant. This was a case that I was involved in. It's a physical abuse case where the child was made to kneel on rice and nails. And in this particular case, the child did recant on the stand. But because these tapes are admissible in court, we can hold these offenders accountable. And we see this in so many cases. We also see that there is a lot of pressure from parents when it comes to this recantation piece. Child sexual abuse. When we talk about comparing it, when victims don't act like victims, does the public think that this happens one time or over a lifetime? They think it happens one time. Your jurors have to be educated, okay? What do we know is the reality? It happens every time he has alone access, right? So it goes against what we think that they would be acting like. I mean, and truly, these repeat event children are seen as less credible by our teams. And so we do a lot in forensic interviewing process in order to be able to give them a lot about one episode. But it's so important to understand that we have got to understand our expectations of what child victims. Do they want the perpetrator to get in trouble? No, they really don't. They're so often bonded, and they don't really want any consequences for the perpetrator. Do they ever accidentally tell? Yes. These are really hard cases, and they can be. So we know the method of disclosure falls in one of these categories. But what's interesting, and I think about with teenagers, most teenagers actually, and they've shown, the research tells us that kids that purposely tell, that they're angry that they got punished, or they're angry they got grounded, and they decide, I've had enough of this, and I'm going to tell. They actually are more in control of the process, and for them, psychologically, they're in a good place to tell. But how do we respond to them? We're less likely to believe them. And it's sort of interesting because when you look at this research, a lot of times the accidental kids that disclose, they have the most anxiety. They weren't ready. They didn't tell in their own good time. They told as an accident. And yet the teenagers, a lot of times, who do purposely tell, we're less likely to believe. So I love this. Are you guys all familiar with the ACE score? You can look on the internet on the CDC's website, and you can figure out what your adverse childhood experience score is. And are you familiar with how they came up with these? So basically, this was the work of Dr. Folletti out in San Diego, and I had the opportunity to co-present with him at an IVAC conference. And basically, he was doing some research. He had done a lot of research with Kaiser on obesity, and he had adult women who had lost a lot of weight. But then spontaneously, a whole bunch of them started gaining weight. So he started asking them questions, and one of the questions was supposed to be, how old were you when you first sexually active, all right? But instead, they asked, how much did you weigh? And a child responded, 40 pounds. And they said, well, that can't be true. You would have been how old? And she says, 7. That was an accidental disclosure. Well, they kept that a question in, and over and over and over. So then he went back and he decided to study people that had obesity. And he found that 50% of them had been sexually abused. So the adverse childhood experience of being sexually abused was causing obesity in later life. So then he got funding from Kaiser and he said, let's study a lot of other things. And sure enough, they found out that if you have these adverse childhood sexual experiences or physical abuse, or potentially a parent going to jail or witnessing domestic violence, all of which are an ACE, that their likelihood of early death was going up. And so they showed that all of these bad things were happening as a result of having an ACE. And you guys can go on the CDC website and actually take the test to see what your ACE score is and how you can prevent these things by addressing your ACE. It's amazing research, and it's brand new, but please check it out and take a look at it. So I came to this work basically through this. I realized that in order for me to be able to explain everything that I'm talking about today, as an attorney, jurors, the detectives, our child protection folks, this wasn't stuff that was part of our regular training. The people that had the knowledge were the forensic specialists, the pediatricians. And so what I had realized early on is that if I didn't have an expert pediatric forensic medical testimony, I could not be successful in holding offenders accountable. And this case sort of was the first case that really showed me that. So this was a case that I prosecuted in 1991. And in this particular case, we had two children that had normal findings, a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old, who had both been penetrated, a little boy and a little girl, over repeatedly. Mom worked at nights at a time saver, and so they said it happened all the time. But both of these kids had normal findings. Now, to my knowledge at this point, it's the first case I was ever involved in, but to my knowledge, and I wasn't the lead prosecutor, but that was the first case in Louisiana that had ever been tried with normal findings. And we didn't know if we would win. And we went to opening statements, and we told them we were going to have normal findings. And I worked with Dr. Kathy Kaufman, who now runs a program in Salt Lake City. And we literally, we just didn't know if we would win in this particular case. And when we were putting the case together, after we had done opening statements, the defense made a statement, and you will hear that this mom knew, and she only reported this to the police when she knew my client, the defendant, the father, was leaving her for another woman. Now, that's the first we had heard of that. So that night, when we were prepping the kids and telling them who's going to sit where and doing our little court module and all this type of stuff, I asked Lauren, I'm like, tell me about the first person you ever told. And she looks down, and I said, I just need to know who's the first person you ever told. She tells me her mom, right? She goes, but please, Miss Stacie, don't let my mom get in trouble. She said I might go to foster care if I told you. And we asked Mom, what's going on here? And Mom says, well, yeah, one night his brother called me up. He was leaving me for another woman. And I said, that's his ASS. And I called the police. I knew he had been doing this to my kids forever. And that's when I reported it. She told his brother that. So tomorrow we know we're going back into court, and that evidence is coming in. We think for sure we're losing this case, right? But we went forward because we already had rolled the dice, right? We think we're going to lose. I don't know if I'd have ever taken this case. I wouldn't know what I know today, that if we didn't believe in jurors, that if given the opportunity, they will believe in our victims. Does that make sense, guys? And I learned, not because I was doing the right thing, because I just got stuck in a hard place. And in this particular case, the jury came back in less than 10 minutes. They didn't take that potty break, and the foreman had said it would take Jesus Christ to come into the courtroom and bail him out, and he didn't show up. Now, I love this foreman. I wanted to give him an award, okay? What do you think the first thing these jurors wanted to tell me when I went over there to ask them, what could we do? What did you think? What could we have done better? I've always loved to ask jurors. And the first thing they turned to the prosecutor, I was processing the case, and he like, well, you should wear a handkerchief that matches your tie. I'm like, okay, thank you for the attire advice. What else could we do here? But the next thing they said is, why can't we convict Mom? And I felt it too. But if we would have tried to convict Mom, would I have ever been able to convict the offender? It's hard. It's hard stuff. So why do they need these exams? So I'm telling you put my prosecutor hat on. Now I run a medical program. The American Academy of Pediatrics says it's not just for you prosecutors. It's not just for you detectives. It's not just for your child protection workers. It's so much more than that, because they actually say it helps ensure that child's well-being. And it really does make the child feel better. And there are so many myths about what they do, that it's traumatic, or that there's a speculum, or that it should only be used if it's just a one-time contact. And what they say is that every child. So we published a book, literally, that Dr. Head was a part of, to explain to children that it doesn't hurt, and to show all of our children that it's a nose to chosen. There's Dr. Head with my niece, and this is my son with Dr. James, our other medical director. So our children are constantly traumatized by this work. But nose to toes checkup. And it truly is a no ouches, but they're going to check everything in between to make sure your body's okay. And I really do believe in it at this point. And the research comes out and says, yes, kids who are given a forensic medical exam actually report feeling better. There's a psychological component to this. And that they have positive feelings increase and their negative feelings decrease. That's pretty doggone good. And that they don't rate that it's in any way painful or distressful. And that 78% said it was a good idea and made them feel better. So these doctors have to explain all of these myths, and you guys have heard them all, right? But Dr. Head, when I was preparing this, I'm like, you want me to cover those? She goes, yes, anybody could potentially be a juror. They need to know. But, we've got to make sure that everybody understands there's plenty of myths about a little piece of tissue, right? And we want to make sure that folks understand that it's so much more than that. Now, we've known for a long time from a scientific standpoint, since Joyce Adams, Dr. Adams, published her research called It's Normal to Be Normal, they knew that you could have an adult penetrating penis and have a completely normal hymen, okay? But it took a long time for us to catch up. There's still a lot of folks who are like, oh, I don't know if we can prosecute these cases. I can tell you, the cases that I was involved in that had definitive findings were harder to get a conviction than the cases with the normal findings. Because it all comes back to focusing on the kid, which is where it should be and where it needs to be. So here was a study with 36 pregnant adolescents. We did one in our program. We've had 7. 36 pregnant adolescents had a normal hymenal finding. And a lot of times the folks will say, this is not a Virgin Mary type of thing. This is the reality. This is the science. It's a myth. I love to tell folks, the whole idea of virginity from a spiritual concept is alive and well. You with me? But from a physical concept, it's a myth. We got to do a lot of work. That's my elevator talk. So you guys get on the elevator and tell everybody that. They'll think you've lost your mind. So how can this be? How can this be? And that's why it's so important to have, medical providers who can explain that, one, it is designed for penetration, and we call it the hymen credo, that it changes over time and it can withstand trauma, and all children are born with it, and that a lot of times injury is minimal. We have a legal definition. In Georgia, you have the same legal definition. That's penetration, however slight. And so you can have penetration through the labia with contact and still, and I have a lot of doctors like to use the analogy in front of the jury. It's like, think about the hot dog in the bun and think of the bun as the labia. I know that seems a little graphic, but sometimes you got to get down to the basics here, okay? So I try not to do too much. So hymenal tissue is very much mucosal tissue. Where else do you have mucosal tissue? In your mouth. Any of you guys ever bit the inside of your mouth? Can you go in the restroom right now and find the scar? So, it's so important that we dispel this myth because folks are expecting something and our victims' bodies don't give us this. Thank goodness. Now, I will give you one graphic picture. This was a case that we were involved in. This was a child that was a witness penetration. Mom walks into the bedroom, the side of the crib was down, and this particular child was being penetrated by an adult neighbor who had come by to visit and had gone into the room to check on the baby. So it's a witness penetration, takes the child in acutely, and on acute is a little bit of redness. Dr. Head would tell you there's not much of a finding there. It's just a little bit of redness. And 24 hours later, you have a full hymenal ring with just a little bit of redness. If a doctor saw this without knowing the history, they would say that could be from diaper rash. And within 2 weeks, it's completely normal. And this has been studied and looked at by lots of Helfer members of child abuse docs. So truly, and then when it comes to the anus, we know the anus was designed by God to let objects out, and it also lets objects in. And again, not to be graphic, but it is so important to understand that you can have this. So the bottom line, when it comes to their bodies, it strongly is indicated that less than 5% actually have definitive findings. But do you understand now why they all need a medical exam? Does that make sense? And can you see it has a psychological component, not just an understanding and, to be able to explain that to the jury. But it all comes down to this history. It all comes down to what the child tells us. And there's some collaboration we can give there. Now, we know that children, there's been some research done by Dr. Finkel in New Jersey. I can tell you because our doctor, a lot of times the kids do tell the doctor a bit more. But the crux of it, beyond just what they tell the doctors, is that collaboration. And that really happens at your Crescent House. That really happens in your forensic interview. It all happens here, and the work that you're doing to support this program in interviewing children in a national model, such as Finding Words, or NICHD, or NCAC, or RADAR, and that it's eliciting the most reliable statement in a non-leading, non-judgmental way, non-blaming, non-shaming, and at a minimum, of course, non-leading and non-suggestive. It's admissible in court, and it gets us the best evidence. Now, what I tell children that come to our program is how brave they are, and I really do believe that. Now, we have a program we call Buttons for Bravery. Every child that comes in, when they leave us, we ask them to pick a button out of our button jar and tell us why they picked that button so we can remember them. And I can't tell you, I had this little girl one time, she literally picks this little bitty pink button. And I said, well, tell me how I'm going to remember you by that button. Tell me about what's special about that button. And she said, well, pink is my favorite color. And I'm like, oh, okay. And she goes, and I feel really small. And I thought to myself, it's so sad. This kid is so brave because she's the brave one. How many in this room have never told their secret? How many people walk around this hospital and have never told their secret? These children are really brave, and we have to honor their bravery. And we ask them to make a wish. Now, sometimes they tell us what their wish is. Many times they don't, okay? And they put this, and I can't tell you how intense they are when they make this wish. I do think a lot of them are wishing it didn't happen, I wish for these kids. I wish for them that they could be safe and that we could find a better system to serve them. And I wish for them a bunch of advocates like yourselves to be here to serve them. And I saw this last year. This was a dad who does lots of triathlons, and his daughter has cerebral palsy. I don't know if anybody saw it. There was a big write-up about him. And it broke my heart. They had all kind of pictures. And every triathlon he's in, he takes his daughter with him to protect her. He has a canoe. When he swims, he has her in the boat. And when he crosses the finish line, he carries her across the finish line. I wish for all the kids that we serve that they could all have a parent like that. And I want to thank and commend each and every one of you because it's the work that you do that one day we will be able to prevent, because I do believe it's preventable, that we will be able to give kids this, because that is my dream for kids that we serve. We have a lot of Facebook page. Everybody's doing Facebook these days. And I ask you to join us and follow us on Facebook. I put a lot of information out there, and I love to get feedback on that page, to get information. This is my son when he was much younger. He's now. And this is my contact information. I really do want to thank you guys and commend you for all the prevention that you're doing here, because this is a solvable problem. And you're a part of that solution. And I just want to thank you for being a part of that solution. And thank you for letting me share this morning with you. So.